It's time to talk about the layers of skin. Skin is also called integument. So integument means tough outer protective layer, hence integumentary system. Cutaneous means anything that has to do with the skin. So it's important to remember those two terms, integument and cutaneous. So skin is the largest organ in the body. And here are some interesting facts about the integumentary system. So a couple, where you find your thickest skin, where you find your thinnest skin. Right here are the layers. It's literally about 15% of your body weight. So if you weigh 100 pounds, you have about 15 pounds of skin. This right here is important for understanding what happens when you have poor regeneration. So if you have fibrosis instead, because scar tissue does not have hair, it also does not have sweat glands. If you have a small scar, no big deal. But if you have a scarring that covers a larger surface area, that could be problematic. So there are three main layers of the integument. There's the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. And the hypodermis is sometimes called the subcutaneous layer or the fatty layer, but for our purposes, we're going to consider it as a main layer of the integument. So what are the three layers of skin? Do you remember? Yeah, epidermis, most superficial, dermis, hypodermis. Okay, now let's focus on the epidermis. That's the most superficial layer of skin. The epidermis is made of stratified, meaning many layers, squamous, meaning thin and flat, especially when you look near the surface, the apical surface. So stratified, squamous epithelium. Now, the epidermis can be thin skin or thick skin. So thin skin is literally almost everywhere. It has 4 layers and it can have hair. Thick skin is found in your palmar and your plantar regions only, and it is 5 layers and hairless. So here's the difference between thin skin and thick skin. So if we look at these side by side, you can see obviously thick skin having more layers, and it actually has an additional layer, which we will talk about. So let's look at these individual layers. All right, so we have the stratum basale. The basale-like base is the deepest layer. It is one singular layer of cells, and it is firmly attached to that basement membrane. So the stratum basale sits on top of the basement membrane. And here is where the stem cells are. Lots and lots and lots of division happening here. Also, this is where there are melanocytes, and which are going to produce melanin. And this is where the epidermal ridges form that extend into the dermis below and create fingerprints. All right, let's go over these 3 key features of the stratum basale. So we have the basement membrane, that's protein fibers, and the stratum basale is going to be attached here, so a firm point of attachment. That basement membrane also provides a barrier so things aren't able to move up through the stratified epithelium. And then we have mitosis happening here, so lots of cell division. So we have stem cells called keratinocytes, and they're located in that stratum basale, that base layer, and they begin dividing here, and then they move up. So the oldest cells would be at the top, and the youngest cells would be down here. So as they age, they move upward. Also, what we have here are melanocytes located in that stratum basale, and they produce melanin. And the purpose of melanin is to shield the cell nuclei from damage from ultraviolet radiation. So it provides like a protective cap over the nucleus so that the ultraviolet light doesn't damage the nucleus. If the nucleus gets damaged, it could result in cancer. All right, so we have the stratum basale. So sitting on top of the stratum basale, we have the stratum spinosum. And this is many layers, not just one. It gives some strength to our skin. So it has these little spiny protrusions that hold the cells tightly together. So that's where spinosum, that these spines, okay? And this helps to prevent tearing and blistering. So the layers kind of work as a group, okay? Cell division continues to happen here. All right, then we have the stratum granulosum. Here, the cells stop dividing and they produce granules, hence granulosum. And what do those granules contain? They have keratin to waterproof the cells. They contain lipids or fats, and they contain a natural moisturizing factor. And then continuing to go superior, stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and then we have stratum lucidum. So this is only in thick skin, and this is a clear layer. So those granules from the granulosum have broken open. The cells are dead, they're flattened, they're densely packed, and they're filled with keratin. And then we have the stratum corneum, and that is our most superficial layer. And it's about 15 to 30 layers of flat, dead, keratinized cells. So the surface is relatively dry, and the purpose of that is to make it unsuitable for the growth of many pathogens. The cells are tightly connected. So when these layers are lost, they're shed in large groups or sheets, okay? And we can often find these in dust, so it's a component of dust. All right, so looking at these layers, again, here we have the stratum basale, single layer, right? Lots of division. We have stem cells, keratinocytes, melanocytes, and the stratum basale sitting on the basement membrane. And then we have the stratum spinosum with those spiny projections that kind of hold the cells as a group. Lots of division happening here. And then we have the stratum granulosum where those granules form, particularly with keratin. And then we have the stratum lucidum, only in thick skin. Granules burst open. And then we have the stratum corneum, completely dead keratinized cells that provide some protection. All right, so how many layers are in the epidermis? 5 in thick, 4 in thin. What layer of the epidermis contains melanocytes? Yeah, the basale. What layer of the epidermis is most superficial? Yeah, stratum corneum. What layer of the epidermis contains only one layer of cells? Yep, stratum basale. What is the deepest layer of the epidermis? Yep, stratum basale. What epidermal layer is present in thick skin only? Yep, stratum lucidum. In what layer of the epidermis do cells stop dividing? Yep, stratum granulosum. It's where they fill with those granules, especially of keratin. So what are the 5 layers of the epidermis in order from superficial to deep? So we're going superficial to deep. Stratum corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. All right, now let's go deeper. So we're going down into the dermis. So we did the epidermis first, now we're going deeper, and we're in the dermis. Okay. So the dermis is deep to the epidermis, and this is where you find hair follicles, you find sweat glands, and this is where the body system connections are made. Because remember, epidermal tissue is avascular, but those tissues literally need nutrients. So the circulatory system connections, the nervous system connections, the lymphatic system connections, they're all found here in the dermis. And the dermis is composed of 2 layers. So let's talk about those layers. We have the papillary dermis. Okay. This is the dermal papillae. So this is where, those dermal ridges form. And the epidermis kind of comes down into these little finger-like projections. This is made of loose connective tissue. So the papillary dermis is loose connective, so areolar tissue. It supports and nourishes the epidermis. So it contains a lot of capillaries and a lot of nerves. And then we have reticular dermis. So this is the deeper layer, and this is dense regular connective tissue. So it has some elastic fibers for flexibility, and it has collagen fibers that go in a crisscross pattern to give both strength and flexibility. So I mentioned those epidermal ridges and dermal papillae, so let's talk about them. So the epidermal ridges form in that stratum basale, and the dermal papillae push up into those spaces, okay, between the epidermal ridges. Why is this important? So it increases contact. So it's just not a flat layer like this. It goes up and down like this. So it keeps the layers connected so that if somebody tugs on your skin, it doesn't just kind of separate between the dermis and the epidermis. So it gives us grip. So it increases contact for diffusion as well, because remember the epidermis is avascular. So having the dermis push up into those areas provides more surface for diffusion to happen. It results in fingerprints. So those ridges are what our fingerprints are. So what do the fingerprints do? Well, and the epidermal ridges, again, they increase contact between the epidermis and the dermis. It increases grip and diffusion. So it keeps your skin from sliding around, and it results in fingerprints. So what layer of the dermis is most superficial? Papillary. What layer of the dermis contains a dense connective tissue? Reticular. All right, and lastly, we're going to go down to the hypodermis, deep to the dermis. The hypodermis is the deepest layer. It's called the subcutaneous layer. It has loose connective tissue. It has many adipose cells. So the loose connective tissue it contains is mostly adipose or fat cells. So it helps to reduce our heat loss. It provides an energy reserve, and it's a shock absorber. There are no vital organs here. And the blood vessels here are larger. So up in the dermis, there's small capillaries, but the larger blood vessels you'll find here in the hypodermis. So that's why this is often a site for injections. Okay, so we have some different types of injections. If you're doing a subcutaneous injection, then you need to get into that hypodermis. Okay. If you're doing an intramuscular injection, to get deeper and go into actually the muscular tissue. Some injections are intradermal, okay, which means it's going to be in between. Okay, so however the needle is arranged, you can tell where actually the injection is attempting to be administered. Is it being administered between the epidermis and the dermis? Is it being administered into the dermis? Is it being administered below in the hypodermis, or even below the hypodermis in the muscle? So what are the 3 layers of the skin from superficial to deep? Epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. So tattoos have to be injected into the dermis. Melanin does block pigment though, because remember, melanin is being produced in that stratum basale and the dermis is deeper. So if your skin has a lot of melanin, it's going to block some of the view of the pigment. So people with less melanin will have often brighter colors of tattoo visible than someone with more melanin. Okay. If any ink is left in the epidermis, as the keratinocytes divide and move upward, that ink would be lost. Okay, so in order for the ink to be in a more permanent location, it's got to be injected into the dermis. All right, and this is going to be your assignment.